I've been living in my house for over a decade now. It's not huge, not fancy, but it's mine. 3 bedrooms, a little backyard, and enough space for me to live comfortably without worrying about roommates or noisy neighbors. I've spent years working overtime, skipping vacations, and budgeting every penny to pay off this place. And now, I can finally sit back, exhale, and enjoy the space I've earned. Enter my younger sister, Katie. She's 28, married to Eric, who's 30. They've got 2 kids, Lily, who's 6, and Jack, who's 4. Katie and Eric have always had this free spirit vibe. You know the type, posting endless photos on Instagram about living in the moment and how they refuse to be chained to a desk. They've always seen me as the boring older brother who's wasting his life paying bills and staying in one place. But here's the kicker. They didn't just talk about escaping the grind. They actually did it. They sold their house, their actual family home, where their kids were growing up, where they had stability. And why? To fund a year-long adventure. No jobs lined up, no real plan. Just savings from the house sale and a belief that they'd figure it out along the way. I remember the day Katie told me their plan. We were at our parents' place for dinner, and she was practically glowing as she described their upcoming journey. She talked about exploring beaches in Thailand, hiking trails in South America, and letting their kids experience the world instead of being stuck in one place. Eric chimed in with his usual speech about how life is too short to spend it chasing promotions and mortgage payments. I kept quiet, but inside I was screaming. They were acting like life was some inspirational movie montage, not real life with real consequences. 2 kids under 7, no guaranteed income, and a limited amount of cash? I knew it was going to end badly. But what was I supposed to say? Hey, Katie, maybe don't sell your house and gamble your kids' security on some eat, pray, love fantasy? It wouldn't have mattered. They were already set on their decision. A couple of months later, Katie and Eric packed up their lives, posted a dramatic farewell photo on Instagram, and took off. For a while, their updates were all sunshine and rainbows. Pictures of Lily and Jack smiling on some tropical beach, Katie sipping cocktails with ocean views behind her, Eric bragging about how free they felt. I'll admit, part of me was jealous. Not of their travels. I've never been the type to care about that, but of how easy they made it look. Like they cracked some secret code the rest of us were too scared to try. But then the posts slowed down. Fewer beach pictures, fewer happy captions. And then, 2 months in, I got a phone call from Katie. Right away, I could tell something was wrong. Her voice was tight, stressed, like she was holding back tears. She didn't even bother with small talk. We're in trouble, she said. Turns out, their budget had disappeared much faster than they expected. Fancy items, eating out every night, and last-minute flights had drained their savings. Katie admitted they'd underestimated just how expensive it was to travel with 2 small kids. Jack had gotten sick twice, and medical bills abroad weren't cheap. Lily wasn't adjusting well to the constant moving. She'd been crying at night, asking when they were going home, and now, with their money almost gone, they were stuck. They couldn't keep traveling, and they couldn't afford to settle anywhere new. That's when Katie dropped the bombshell. Can we stay with you? Just for a while. Maybe 10 months, just until we figure things out. I sat there holding my phone, stunned into silence. My 3-bedroom house is comfortable, for me, but adding 4 people, including 2 little kids, into the mix? That's not just inconvenient, it's chaos. Katie kept talking, saying how they wouldn't be any trouble, how the kids would stay out of my way, how they'd clean up after themselves. She even promised they'd mostly stay in their room, like that would somehow make the situation less insane. And then came the part that really got me. They wanted to stay rent-free. No offer to chip in for bills, groceries, or anything. Just, let us crash at your place for almost a year, and we'll figure it out eventually. I took a deep breath and said no. I tried to be gentle about it. I said I loved her, that I wanted to help, but this wasn't the way. I offered to help them find a short-term rental nearby. I even said I'd pitch in financially for a couple of months until they could get back on their feet. But Katie wasn't having it. Her voice turned sharp. Are you serious? We're family, Nick. Family. You have a house all to yourself, and you're really going to turn us away when we have nowhere to go? I stayed calm and repeated my offer to help in other ways. But it wasn't good enough for her. She accused me of being selfish, of being greedy, of not understanding what it means to be there for family. She even said I was probably jealous of their lifestyle. Jealous? Are you kidding me? I felt my temper rising, but I kept it together. Katie, this isn't about jealousy. This is about boundaries. You made a choice, a reckless one, and now you want me to pay the price for it. She hung up on me. For a day or two, I thought that was the end of it. I figured she'd cool off and realize I wasn't the villain she was making me out to be. But I underestimated just how far she was willing to take this. Because a few days later, I got a call from our mom. And that's when things started to get really messy. A couple of days after Katie hung up on me, I figured the dust had settled. I assumed she'd either find another option, or at least give herself time to cool down before trying to talk again. But no, turns out, she went straight to our parents. It started with a call from Mom. Now, my mom isn't the type to yell or scold. She's more of a disappointed sigh kind of person, the type that makes you feel guilty without her even raising her voice. So when I picked up the phone and heard her quiet, serious tone, I knew Katie had gotten to her first. "Nick, I just don't understand," Mom started, already sounding tired. "Your sister came to you in her time of need, and you turned her away. They have 2 kids, Nick. Little kids. They can't just live on the streets." I took a deep breath because I could feel the argument already forming in my chest. "Mom, I didn't turn them away. I offered to help, money, finding them a rental, whatever they needed. But letting 4 people move into my house for 10 months rent-free isn't something I can do." "But why not?" she pressed. "You have space, you're alone in that big house, and their family. Surely you can make some sacrifices for them." I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "It's not about space, Mom. It's about boundaries. I've worked hard for my home, for my peace and stability. Having 4 extra people, 2 of them kids, would completely upend my life. And let's not pretend this is just for a little while. They don't even have a plan for what happens after those 10 months. Are they getting jobs? Are they going to find a new place? Or are they just going to keep drifting and hoping someone else will bail them out again?" Mom sighed, and I could tell she wasn't really listening, at least, not to understand. "I just think you're being a little harsh. They've made mistakes, sure, but they're trying their best, and they need help right now. Isn't that what family is for?" I could feel the guilt creeping in, but I pushed it back down. "I love Katie, and I love the kids, but this isn't something I can do. I've offered other ways to help. If that's not enough for her, then that's on her, not me." We hung up shortly after, and I thought, naively, that maybe that would be the end of it. But, of course, it wasn't. The next day, Dad called. And unlike Mom, Dad doesn't do disappointed sighs or emotional guilt trips. He goes straight for the throat. "Nick," he said, his voice sharp, "what the hell is wrong with you?" "Oh boy, here we go." "I talked to your sister," he continued, not waiting for me to respond. "She told me everything. You're seriously sitting in that house by yourself while your own family is struggling? Are you really that selfish?" "Dad, I'm not being selfish," I said, already feeling the familiar frustration bubbling up. "I offered to help them in other ways, but I'm not letting them move in for nearly a year with no rent, no plan, and no clear end in sight." "That's just an excuse," he snapped. "You've always been like this, hoarding your money, your space, your time. Meanwhile, your sister takes risks, lives her life, and now, when she needs you, you turn your back on her." "Risks?" I repeated, incredulous. "Selling your house and burning through your savings in 2 months isn't taking a risk, Dad. It's being irresponsible. They had 2 kids to think about, and they gambled everything on some fantasy adventure. And now, because their plan fell apart, I'm supposed to clean up the mess? They're your family," Dad said through gritted teeth. "Family helps family, Nick. I raised you better than this." "And I'm helping them," I argued back, "just not in the way they want. I'm not giving up my peace and sanity because they couldn't plan ahead." The call ended badly. Dad hung up on me after muttering something about me being cold-hearted. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering how I'd become the villain in this story. Over the next few days, things escalated. Mom started texting me every morning with little guilt-loaded messages like, I hope you slept well in your big empty house while your sister is struggling to find a roof over her kids' heads. Meanwhile, Katie wasn't done either. She'd clearly been talking to other family members because suddenly, my phone was lighting up with messages from cousins, aunts, and even old family friends. Nick, just let them stay. It's only temporary. Wow, can't believe you'd leave your sister and her kids out in the cold. You've got the space. What's the big deal? Every message felt like a tiny jab, and no matter how many times I explained my side, how I'd offered financial help, how I'd tried to be reasonable, it felt like no one was listening. The worst part? Katie wasn't just stopping at family and friends. She started posting vague but pointed updates on social media. Posts like, "It's always the people you think you can rely on who disappoint you the most." Or, "Family means nothing to some people. Lesson learned." And of course, the comments were full of sympathy. People chiming in with, "You deserve better, Katie," and "Some people just don't have hearts." Every time I saw one of those posts, my blood boiled. She was painting herself as the victim while making me look like some greedy Scrooge hoarding my house and money. Then came the final straw. Katie texted me directly. "I can't believe you've done this to us. We trusted you. We thought you'd be there for us when we needed you. But you've shown your true colors. You care more about your empty house than your own family. Don't bother reaching out again." I stared at that message for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. I wasn't the one who sold my house on a whim. I wasn't the one who blew through thousands of dollars in 2 months. I wasn't the one who had kids depending on me and still chose recklessness over responsibility. But somehow, I was the villain. I put my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and let out a long, frustrated sigh. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Katie wasn't done, and my parents weren't done. And as much as I wanted to just lock my doors and ignore the world, I had a sinking feeling that the worst was still ahead of me. About a week after Katie's last text, things went quiet. Too quiet. No calls from Mom, no passive-aggressive messages from Dad, and Katie had stopped posting cryptic guilt trips on social media. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that maybe they'd all finally realized I wasn't going to cave. But no, that silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the next storm. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the middle of cleaning up my kitchen when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my stomach immediately sank. I had a feeling I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Sure enough, there stood Katie and Eric, both looking haggard and stressed. Behind them were their kids, Lily and Jack, standing close to their parents and clutching stuffed animals. They didn't even try to hide their intention this time. No fake small talk, no pretending they just happened to be in the neighborhood. "Nick," Katie said, her voice already trembling, "please, just hear us out." I stepped aside and let them in. I figured it was better to have this conversation inside, rather than on my porch with the neighbors watching. We sat in the living room. The kids settled awkwardly on the floor with their toys while Katie and Eric sat across from me on the couch. Katie was gripping Eric's hand, so tightly her knuckles were white. "We're out of options," Eric said after a long silence. "We've tried everything. Rentals, motels, even staying with friends. But nothing's working out. Everywhere we go, it's either too expensive, too small, or they don't want kids. We can't keep doing this. The kids need stability, Nick. They need a home." I sighed and rubbed my face with both hands. I understand that, but I've already explained why this isn't going to work. My house isn't set up for 4 more people, especially kids. This isn't just a quick weekend stay. It's 10 months. That's almost a year of my life turned completely upside down. Katie's voice cracked as she spoke. "We don't have anywhere else to go. We're not asking for luxury or anything special. Just a place to sleep, to shower, to breathe. Please, Nick, don't do this to us." Her words hit hard, especially when I glanced at Lily and Jack, who were sitting there quietly, probably too young to understand the full weight of the situation, but still old enough to know something was wrong. I felt like the world's biggest jerk, but I had to stay firm. "I offered to help with rent, Katie. I offered to give you money, to help you find a short-term rental. But you turned that down because it wasn't exactly what you wanted. That's not on me." Eric, who'd been silent up until now, suddenly snapped. "Come on, man. You have this whole house to yourself. You've got space. You've got money. How hard would it really be to let us stay for a few months? You're acting like this is some huge sacrifice, but you're just being stubborn. That lit a spark of anger in me. Don't do that, I said, my voice low. Don't sit there and act like this is easy for me. This isn't just about space. It's about my life. My peace. My routine. I worked for this. I earned this. And you want me to just hand it over because you two decided to gamble your entire savings on a fantasy trip around the world? No, that's not fair to me. Katie started crying, quietly at first, but then she buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders started shaking. Lily looked up and stared at her mom, eyes wide and confused. Jack leaned closer to his dad, clutching his stuffed animal tighter. Eric let out a long sigh and shook his head. Fine. I guess we get it. Come on, Katie, let's go. But Katie didn't move. She stayed on the couch, crying into her hands, while Eric gently touched her shoulder. Nick, she said between sobs, you're our brother. You're their uncle. How can you look at them and still say no? How can you let us walk out that door knowing we have nothing? I had to look away because, honestly, it was breaking me. I didn't want to be in this position. I didn't want to have to say no to my sister while her kids sat there, quiet and confused. But I knew if I said yes now, it would spiral into something I couldn't control. 10 months would turn into longer. Promises of staying out of my way would fade. My home, my sanctuary, would become chaos. After what felt like hours of silence, I finally spoke. I'm sorry. I can't. Katie didn't say anything else. She just stood up, wiping her face, and motioned for the kids to follow her. Eric got up too, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch, and they all walked to the door. I didn't follow them out. I couldn't bring myself to watch them leave like that. Instead, I sat down on my couch, head in my hands, and let the guilt crash over me like a wave. That night, the texts started again. First from Mom. Katie told me what happened. I can't believe you let your sister walk out like that. You should be ashamed of yourself. Then Dad. You had the chance to do the right thing, Nick, and you blew it. Don't expect us to forget this anytime soon. My aunt chimed in next. Family is everything, Nick. You'll regret this someday. The worst was a single message from Katie herself. You made your choice. I hope you're happy with it. It felt like everyone was against me, like no one was willing to see my side of things. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the afternoon over and over in my head. Could I have said something different? Could I have handled it better? But no matter how much I tried to twist it, I always landed on the same conclusion. This wasn't my fault. I wasn't the one who made reckless choices. I wasn't the one who gambled everything and lost. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Katie wasn't going to let it end here. And my family definitely wasn't done making me feel like the villain. A few days after Katie and Eric left my house, things started to settle. Or at least, I tried to convince myself they did. The texts from my parents slowed down, the guilt trip calls stopped, and Katie went radio silent. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the kind of quiet you get right before a thunderstorm tears through everything. I tried to go about my routine. Work, gym, cooking dinner, zoning out in front of the TV. But the weight of it all lingered in the background. Every time I sat down in my living room, I couldn't help but picture Katie and Eric sitting on my couch, her face buried in her hands, the kids clutching their stuffed animals. I hated how much space this whole situation had taken up in my mind. And then, one evening, my doorbell rang again. My stomach tightened immediately. I swear, I could have ignored it, pretended I wasn't home, but the persistent ringing made that impossible. I opened the door to find Mom standing there, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Can I come in? She asked softly. I stepped aside and she walked in, glancing around my living room like she was inspecting it. She didn't sit down, just stood there, arms crossed over her chest. I don't know what to say to you, Nick, she started, her voice trembling slightly. Katie is struggling. They're all struggling. And I don't understand how you can sit here in this big, empty house and not feel compelled to help them. Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I have tried to help them. I offered money. I offered to help find a rental. But they didn't want that. They wanted this. My house. My space. And I'm sorry, but I can't give that to them. But it's just for a little while, she pressed. 10 months isn't forever. I felt my frustration rising again, but I bit it back. 10 months is a long time, Mom. And you and I both know it wouldn't just be 10 months. They don't have a plan. They're still talking about traveling again when they scrape together enough money. This isn't about regrouping and rebuilding. It's about stalling. And I won't let them do that here. She sighed heavily and finally sat down on the edge of the couch, her shoulders slumping forward. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she looked exhausted. Not angry, not disappointed, just tired. They've been staying in a motel, she said after a pause. A cramped little room with 2 double beds. The kids are miserable. Eric's trying to find work, but nothing's panning out. Katie, she's not handling it well. She's barely eating. Nick, she feels like she failed her family. Hearing that hit harder than I expected. For all of Katie's dramatics, for all the ways she tried to guilt me, she was still my sister. And no part of me wanted her to be miserable, or to see her kids suffering because of their parents' choices. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the anger I felt, the resentment that this entire mess was the result of decisions they made. Decisions they refused to take responsibility for. I sat down across from Mom and rubbed my temples. I hate that they're going through this. But, Mom, they did this to themselves. They sold their house. They burned through their money. They made a reckless decision with 2 kids depending on them. And now, they want me to clean it up. How is that fair? Mom didn't respond right away. She just stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting around the strap of her purse. Sometimes life doesn't work out the way we plan, she said softly. And when that happens, family is supposed to be there to catch us. I let out a long sigh. But where does it stop, Mom? If I let them move in now, what happens in 10 months when they still don't have a plan? When they've burned through whatever money they've managed to scrape together by then? What if they're still talking about chasing cheap flights and seeing the world instead of settling down and building a stable life for their kids? Am I supposed to keep saying yes forever? She looked up at me then, and for a split second, I thought she might finally understand. But instead, she just shook her head. I don't know, Nick, but I do know that your sister needs you. And so do those kids. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt, and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back and said, You might not regret this now, but one day you might. And I hope you're prepared for that. When the door closed behind her, I sat there in silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something crack inside me. The guilt had been simmering under the surface this whole time, but now it felt like it was boiling over. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Katie sitting on my couch, crying. I saw Lily and Jack holding onto their stuffed animals, looking confused and scared. And worst of all, I kept hearing Mom's voice in my head, You might regret this one day. The next morning, I texted Katie, Hey, can we talk? No response. A few hours later, I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. That's when I realized she wasn't going to answer me. She was done. And maybe she had every right to be. For the next few days, I kept trying to push it all out of my mind, to focus on work and anything else that would distract me. But it didn't work. The weight of it sat on my chest every hour of every day. Then, about a week later, I found out, through a cousin, of all people, that Katie and Eric had moved into my parents' tiny apartment. 2 adults, 2 kids, and my aging parents all crammed into a small 2-bedroom space. I couldn't believe it. My parents could barely handle living on their own, let alone with 4 extra people. I thought about calling Mom, about asking her what the hell she was thinking. But I stopped myself because I already knew what she'd say. They had nowhere else to go. I sat in my quiet, empty house that night, staring at the walls and feeling something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't anger. It was something in between. This whole situation was a mess, and no matter how much I tried to justify my decision, it felt like nobody was winning. Not me, not Katie, and definitely not my parents. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Not even close. The silence didn't last long. After hearing through the family grapevine that Katie, Eric, and the kids had moved into my parents' tiny two-bedroom apartment. I braced myself for the fallout. And sure enough, it came, fast and loud. The first call came from Dad. I was barely awake when my phone buzzed, his name flashing on the screen. "Nick," he said, his voice sharp and tired. "I hope you're happy. Your mother isn't sleeping. She's been running herself ragged, trying to keep things together around here." I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. "Dad, I didn't make this situation. Katie and Eric made their choices. They put themselves, and their kids, in this mess." He let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? And where's your compassion, Nick? Where's your sense of family loyalty? You've got a whole house to yourself while your sister and her kids are crammed into our spare room. Do you know how hard it is for your mother to watch her grandkids sleep on a mattress on the floor every night?" I had no good response to that because, honestly, I felt sick just thinking about it. I could picture my parents' small apartment perfectly, the cramped living room doubling as a play area, Katie and Eric trying to sleep on a pull-out couch while Lily and Jack curled up on a thin mattress surrounded by scattered toys. But despite how awful that image was, I couldn't shake the thought that this was still not my mess to fix. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. But I can't let them move in here." I offered financial help. I offered other options. They said no. What else was I supposed to do? "What were you supposed to do?" Dad repeated, his voice rising. "You were supposed to step up, Nick. You were supposed to be the older brother. But instead, you locked your doors and let your family suffer. That's what you did." He hung up before I could say another word. For hours after that, I couldn't focus on anything. I just kept replaying the conversation in my head, over and over. Every time I started to feel firm in my decision, my mind would wander back to Lily and Jack sleeping on the floor, Katie crying on my couch, Mom wearing herself thin, trying to keep everyone comfortable. That night, I drove to a grocery store across town. I couldn't stomach the idea of bumping into anyone I might know while I stood in the middle of the aisles, throwing snacks, diapers, and toiletries into my cart. I bought 2 massive bags of groceries, some basic toys for the kids, and a couple of gift cards for a local restaurant. The next morning, I showed up at my parents' place unannounced. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the tension in the air. The apartment was cluttered, chaotic, and far too small for 6 people. Katie was sitting on the couch, holding Jack in her lap, while Lily sat on the floor coloring in a crumpled coloring book. Eric was at the tiny dining table with his laptop open, frustration etched across his face as he scrolled through what looked like job postings. Mom appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Nick. Oh, you didn't tell us you were coming." Katie glanced up at me briefly but then looked away, her jaw tight. Eric gave me a small nod but didn't say anything. I set the grocery bags down on the dining table. I brought some stuff. Food, diapers, some gift cards. For a moment, no one said anything. Mom started unpacking the bags, her hands shaking slightly as she held up a box of cereal and set it aside. Eric muttered a quiet, "Thanks, man." But Katie didn't speak. I cleared my throat. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to rehash everything. I wanted to help in whatever way I can. And this is something I can do." Katie finally looked up at me, her eyes red and tired. "It's not enough, Nick." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I know you think you've done your part," she continued, her voice low but steady, "but it's not enough. This isn't sustainable. Mom's exhausted, Dad's stressed, and the kids." She stopped, looking down at Jack, who had fallen asleep in her lap. "They deserve better than this." I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "Katie, I'm sorry. I really am. But my answer hasn't changed. I can't let you all move in with me. It's not about not caring. It's about boundaries. And my boundary is my home." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded slowly. "Right. Boundaries." The rest of the visit was painfully awkward. I stayed for another hour, playing with Lily, trying to make small talk with Eric, and helping Mom organize the groceries. But Katie barely said another word to me. When I left, Mom walked me to the door. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for coming, Nick, and thank you for helping. I wish things were different." "Me too, Mom," I said softly. Driving home, I felt hollow. I'd done something, but it still didn't feel like enough. And maybe that's because, deep down, I knew Katie was right. This situation couldn't last. My parents couldn't keep living like this, and neither could Katie and Eric. A few days later, Katie posted another emotional message on Facebook. Something about leaning on the people who truly care, and how sometimes you realize who's really there for you when things fall apart. The comments were full of sympathy again. Family members, old friends, even people I barely remembered all chiming in with their support. I didn't respond. I didn't even read the whole post. But then, the next morning, I got another text from Mom. Your dad and I are looking into a loan to help Katie and Eric get into a rental. It's not ideal, but we can't keep living like this. I just thought you should know. Alone. My retired parents, who were already barely scraping by, were planning to go into debt to clean up Katie and Eric's mess. I stared at the text for a long time before finally tossing my phone onto the couch and burying my face in my hands. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. And somehow, I knew that no matter what happened next, I'd still end up being painted as the villain in someone's version of this story. A week after Mom's text about the loan, I felt like I was walking around with a boulder strapped to my chest. Every time I thought about my parents, sitting at their tiny dining table, crunching numbers to figure out how much debt they could afford to take on, I felt sick. They'd already worked their entire lives. They deserved peace, not sleepless nights worrying about their daughter's next rent payment. I thought about calling Mom, about begging her not to do it. But I already knew how that conversation would go. She'd tell me it was their choice, their burden to carry, and she'd probably slip in another comment about how all of this could have been avoided if I just said yes in the first place. The worst part was that Katie still wasn't talking to me. I'd see her posts on social media, passive-aggressive quotes about family loyalty, about how hard times reveal true character, and everyone felt like a jab. Eric had posted once too, something about how some people prioritize their own comfort over their family's survival. It was vague enough not to name me, but everyone knew who it was about. I tried to distract myself with work, with going to the gym, with mindless TV shows. But every night, as I sat alone in my quiet house, the guilt crept in. A few days later, I got a text from my cousin, Sarah. Hey, just a heads up, Katie and Eric found a rental. It's tiny and pretty run down, but they're moving in next week. Your parents put down the deposit for them. Thought you'd want to know. I stared at the screen for a long time. Relief washed over me first. At least they'd have a place of their own. At least my parents would get their space and their sanity back. But then came the anger. Of course, it had come to this. Of course, my parents had to step in and clean up the mess. But what really got me was the image in my head. Katie and Eric moving their kids into a dingy little rental, my parents holding a check they couldn't afford to write, and all of them, every single one, probably blaming me for how it all played out. That weekend, I decided to visit my parents. I hadn't seen them since the day I brought over groceries, and I felt like I owed them at least some kind of face-to-face conversation. When I walked into their apartment, I was hit by how quiet it was. The chaos of Katie and her family was gone, and for the first time in weeks, the place felt still. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window. Dad was in his recliner, flipping through a newspaper but not really reading it. They both looked exhausted. Hey, I said softly as I walked in. Mom looked up, her face lighting up for a brief second before the tiredness crept back in. Nick, you didn't tell us you were coming. I wanted to check on you guys, I said, pulling out a chair at the table. For a while, we just sat there. Dad grunted a greeting from his chair, but didn't look up from his paper. So, they found a place, I said eventually. Mom nodded, taking a sip of her tea. It's not great, but it's something. The kids will have their own little corner. It's better than nothing. I hesitated before asking, how much did you have to put down? She waved her hand dismissively. Don't worry about it, Nick. Mom, seriously? She sighed and set down her mug. A few thousand. First and last month's rent, security deposit. They'll pay us back eventually. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting into knots. They said they'd pay you back? They promised, she said, but there wasn't much conviction in her voice. We sat in silence for a while after that. I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying hanging heavy in the air. Eventually, Dad spoke up without looking away from his newspaper. You know, Nick, I don't think you're a bad guy. But I hope you know this didn't have to go the way it did. My jaw tightened. Dad, He held up a hand to stop me. It's done now. No point going back and forth about it. But it's going to take us a while to recover from this. Financially and everything else. Mom gave me a sad smile, but she didn't say anything. I left not long after that. The drive home felt longer than usual, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt completely drained. For the next few weeks, things were quiet. Katie and Eric moved into their rental. The passive-aggressive posts stopped. My parents stopped calling me with updates or subtle guilt trips. Life just went still. But stillness isn't always peace. I could feel the cracks in our family, even from a distance. Holiday plans were vague, group texts were half-hearted, and no one really seemed interested in bridging the gap. One afternoon, I got a message from Katie. Just 2 words, thank you. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what it meant. Was it sarcastic? Was it genuine? Was it just some fleeting attempt at reconciliation before the bitterness crept back in? I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. The truth is, I don't know if things will ever go back to how they were. I don't know if Katie and I will ever fully repair the damage done by this mess, or if my parents will ever really forgive me for not stepping up in the way they wanted me to. But I do know this. I didn't make their choices for them. I didn't sell their house. I didn't burn through their savings. And I didn't refuse to take responsibility for any of it. I set a boundary. I stuck to it. And maybe that makes me the villain in their story, but at least I can live with myself knowing I didn't sacrifice my sanity, my space, and my peace to clean up a mess I didn't create. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't feel good. It doesn't come with applause or gratitude. Sometimes, it just feels like sitting in your quiet house, staring at a 2-word text message from your sister, and wondering if you'll ever stop feeling like the bad guy. But if that's the price of holding on to my boundaries, then I'll pay it. Every time.